At 5:58 a.m., in a silent French village, an American sergeant pressed his back against a burned-out doorway, listening to a German patrol move closer with every step. His platoon was scattered, 2 men wounded, 1 missing. No radio, no support, just the weight of 11 lives on his shoulders. In his hand, he gripped a crude device he'd built from scrap. Something command had banned, something no manual even mentioned. But rules don't matter when the enemy is 10 feet away and you're the only one still thinking clearly. In the next few seconds, he'd risk everything, or lose everyone. The U.S. Army manuals listed 16 official ways to stop light armored vehicles, none of which this sergeant had ever touched in the field. What he carried wasn't authorized, wasn't inspected, and definitely wasn't appreciated by battalion command. Twice they'd warned him with court-martial papers for creating his own improvised fixes. But rules feel meaningless when you've buried more friends in 3 weeks than you can remember, all because the so-called approved methods needed gear no unit ever actually received. He tightened the handmade device in his hands, the cold morning fog settling over the valley like a heavy, damp shroud. He could hear the enemy vehicle long before he saw it, the harsh, metallic grind of an SDK-FC engine forcing its way through the gears. The commander's hatch cracked open as he searched for the American positions everyone already knew were hidden somewhere in that fog. The improvised wire quivered between the sergeant's fingers. One chance, no second try. He steadied his breathing. Before the war, he'd been just a kid from Gary, Indiana, a steelworker's son who watched his father come home coated in furnace dust after 15-hour shifts, earning just enough to feed 6 children and keep the lights on. He'd always been the middle child, the one who preferred the rail yards over a classroom, wandering between freight lines after school while other kids played ball. Out there, he learned things no textbook taught: which cars hauled which loads, which couplers were prone to snapping, how a single weak link could cripple an entire train. By 17, he was apprenticing as a switchman, handling real machinery and real consequences. That job wired his mind to see systems, chains of cause and effect. How one overlooked pin could send 6 cars off the tracks and turn routine work into disaster. A worn cable could snap without warning, taking a brakeman's life in an instant. You learned to read the signs before disaster struck and to improvise solutions with nothing but wire, rope, and sheer ingenuity, because the company certainly wasn't buying new equipment. By January 1943, 3 months past his 19th birthday, he enlisted. The recruiter had promised structured training, steady pay, and a ticket to see the world. What Dalton actually received was 8 grueling weeks of basic training, a rifle he'd never fired, and a voyage across the Atlantic to the unforgiving deserts and hills of North Africa. By September 1943, when he finally set foot in Italy, Dalton had already learned the hard truth. The recruiter's promises were lies. The 34th Infantry Division pushed relentlessly up the Italian peninsula, grinding villages and ridges under the weight of constant combat. Every hamlet was a battlefield. Every ridge bristled with German machine guns. Every river crossing demanded a blood toll. Yet more Americans fell not to direct fire, but to the silent and deadly eyes of German reconnaissance. Scouts and armored cars that appeared out of nowhere, gathered intelligence, and vanished before anyone could respond. These were no ordinary vehicles, light armored cars and half-tracks that scoured American positions at dawn and dusk, ready to call in deadly artillery on any troop concentrations they discovered. The SDK-FC 222 was the Wehrmacht's favorite. 4-wheeled, open-topped, equipped with a 20mm autocannon and an MG-34 machine gun. Fast enough to vanish before retaliation, armored enough to shrug off rifle fire, yet light and nimble enough to navigate mountain paths that tigers and panthers couldn't dream of tackling. To Dalton and his men, these scouts were ghosts, relentless, unstoppable, and always one step ahead. They seemed to materialize out of thin air, tearing through positions with cannon fire and disappearing before anyone could even lift a rifle. Official American doctrine dictated anti-tank rifles, bazookas, or mines as the proper counter. The reality was far grimmer. There were none. The entire 34th Infantry Division had just 9 bazookas. Anti-tank rifles had long been retired. Mines were stockpiled for defensive lines, not daily patrols. For Dalton and his men, the rules meant nothing. The enemy's scouts moved like shadows, and survival depended on improvisation, courage, and a willingness to bend every rule in the book. Soldiers didn't just die from bullets, they fell because enemy scouts mapped their positions, called in artillery, and returned 12 hours later to claim the cost. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski was one of them. On February 18, 1944, an SDP FC-222 rolled past his foxhole at first light. Kowalski raised his M1 Garand, but the rounds bounced harmlessly off the armored car. The scout's MG-34 spoke next, and Kowalski took 3 fatal rounds in the chest. He was just 20, a machinist's son from Pittsburgh, who enlisted the same day as Dalton, and would never make it home. Sergeant Mike Brennan fell on February 23rd. Another dawn, another SDK FC-222 gliding silently through the mist. He hurled a grenade from 30 yards, missed. The autocannon answered instantly. Brennan had been Dalton's mentor, how to dig a proper fighting position, read the terrain, and even keep your boots dry in the endless Italian mud. He was 24, from Brooklyn, with 4 sisters waiting at home. His mother would receive the telegram on March 2nd. Then came Corporal Louis Vargas on March 4th. Same pattern. The enemy scouts, the 2-ton Tutus, were growing bolder, and Dalton's unit was bleeding with every sunrise.
This time, the scout car tore straight through the company's position at dusk, its machine guns spitting fire. Corporal Luis Vargas ran for cover. From El Paso, he spoke better Spanish than English, and always shared his cigarettes, even when he had only 3 left. The autocannon found him anyway. The medic fought in vain. The bleeding wouldn't stop. By early March 1944, the 34th Infantry Division had lost 47 men in just 6 weeks, not in pitched battles, not in frontal assaults, but to relentless reconnaissance vehicles, while the Americans had no way to strike back. Dalton watched every loss. He knew Kowalski and Brennan personally. Vargas had been part of his squad. Each death should have been preventable. Each death ignited a growing fury inside him. Battalion's response was exactly as expected. Maintain defensive positions, conserve the scarce anti-tank assets, and wait for resupply that might never come. Captain Morrison called a meeting after Vargas's death. 20 exhausted soldiers crammed into a barn that reeked of gunpowder and wet wool. Morrison lectured that higher command was aware of the reconnaissance threat. His uniform looked cleaner than theirs, but his words offered no solutions. He had come straight from division headquarters that morning. New bazooka shipments are expected within the month. Until then, maintain discipline. Follow engagement protocols. Dalton lingered at the back, mind racing. He had been studying this problem for weeks. The lessons from the Gary rail yards were clear. When new equipment isn't coming, you improvise with what you have. And these scout cars weren't unpredictable. They always stuck to the same roads, the same patterns. He just had to figure out how to turn that knowledge into a weapon before more men died. They were fast, but they weren't random. Their routes were almost clockwork, and Dalton had noticed a weakness no one else bothered to exploit: the wheels. "Sir," he said carefully, "what if we stretched wire across the road, low enough to catch an axle, tight enough to stop them cold?" Corporal Morrison stared at him like he'd suggested knocking out armored cars with slingshots. "Corporal," he replied, "the field manual is explicit about authorized anti-vehicle obstacles. Wire entanglements are classified as defensive measures and require proper supports and approved placement. We're not improvising traps out here." "It wouldn't be a booby trap, sir, if we just—" "The answer is no. We are not stringing improvised tripwires across roads. They could injure our own men. That's final. Dismissed. Dalton bit back his response, but he didn't let the idea die. The scout cars kept prowling the valley. More Americans kept falling. The so-called approved methods all depended on equipment they didn't have and wouldn't receive anytime soon. His forbidden method needed only wire, a pair of shovels, and the willingness to risk a court-martial if it meant keeping his men alive. On the night of March 10, 1944, Dalton made his choice. Earlier that afternoon, another SDKF-022 had claimed 2 more lives, Privates Chen and Harrison. Chen, a radio operator from San Francisco. Harrison, an Oklahoman who never stopped talking about his farm. Both gone because a single scout car had rolled through at 4 p.m. and no one had the means to stop it. Dalton waited until midnight. The company was entrenched along the Rapido River Valley, 2 miles south of Casino. German positions loomed across the northern ridgeline, watching, waiting, and unaware that the rules were about to be broken. The scout cars always followed the same dirt road, about 400 yards out, running parallel to Allied lines. Shielded by trees, it was the perfect reconnaissance path, and they never deviated from it. Dalton knew it by heart. That night, he slipped to the supply dump and hauled out a coil of barbed wire, 30 feet of rusted, brutal steel, still strong enough to do damage. He grabbed 2 entrenching tools, the folding shovels every soldier carried, and stepped off into the dark. No permission, no backup, no witnesses. Just a cold March night, and a plan that could save his men or get him court-martialed by sunrise. The mud clung to his boots with every step, threatening to pull him down. From the northern ridge, artillery growled endlessly. Distant rolling thunder that never truly faded. The road ahead looked empty, but Dalton knew better. German patrols used it constantly. If they spotted him out here alone, he'd be dead or taken before he could even reach for his rifle. He kept moving until he found it. A narrow pinch in the road framed by 2 thick oak trees. From the American lines, the view was clear. From the German side, visibility was nearly zero until you were right on top of it. Perfect. Dangerous, but perfect. Dalton planted the first entrenching tool into the muddy road bank on the left, angling it back towards the American lines. 6 inches sunk, but it wasn't enough. He hammered it deeper with a rock until 12 inches held firm. 18 feet across, he drove the second shovel, pacing to measure the distance precisely. Then came the wire. 30 feet of rusted barbed wire. He wrapped in 3 tight loops around the first shovel's handle. Mud and rust slicked his hands. The wire bit into his skin. Cold mixed with blood. Pain sharpened his focus. There was no turning back. Dalton stretched the wire across the road, setting it exactly 14 inches above the mud. Not ankle height, not waist, but axle height for a light-armored car. He had measured a destroyed SDKF-022 during a patrol 2 weeks prior. The front axle sat between 13 and 15 inches, depending on the load. The wire had to catch it at speed without snapping. Wrapping the other end around the second shovel, he made 3 tight loops again. Then, he tested the tension. The wire hummed under pressure. The shovels held firm. Too loose, it would break. Too tight, and it might fail catastrophically.
If I did see something, hypothetically, Morrison asked, would it work again? Yes, Dalton replied. Can you teach me? That night, under cover of darkness, Dalton led Morrison back to the road. 2 more shovels, 30 feet of barbed wire, a new stretch 300 yards north. Same height, same tension, same careful burial. Morrison worked the setup himself while Dalton watched, correcting only when necessary. By March 15th, 6 soldiers in the company knew the method. Dalton hadn't told them. Morrison had told 1. The secret spread quietly, like a shadow, ensuring survival without inviting command scrutiny. The technique spread the way all forbidden things do, in whispers, long after the officers had turned in for the night. One soldier told another, and the quiet network that exists in every unit came alive. Private Jackson rigged a line along the road to San Pietro. Private Ali strung one near the Garigliano River. Corporal Williams set his across a narrow trail the Germans favored for night patrols. None of them had orders. None filed reports. They didn't ask, didn't explain. They simply acted.
quiet defiance born from too many funerals and not enough weapons. On March 18th, the second SDKFZ-222 struck Jackson's wire. The result was identical. The car flipped, killing the commander and wounding the crew. Jackson had the foresight to remove the wire before any investigation could begin. 3 days later, on March 21st, the third car hit O'Malley's trap. It didn't flip entirely, but it crashed hard enough to render the vehicle inoperable. The crew abandoned it. By March 25th, German reconnaissance in the 34th Division sector had plummeted by 60%. What had started as one man's desperate gamble had become a quiet revolution in survival. The SDKFZ-222s were still out probing, but something had changed. They moved slower, took alternate routes, and showed a caution that hadn't existed before. Something had shifted, and they didn't know why. Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division noticed first. Commanding a reconnaissance platoon of 3 experienced SDKFZ-222 crews, had patrolled the casino sector since January. He knew the roads, he knew the American positions, and over the past 2 weeks, 3 of his scout cars had been destroyed under circumstances that defied explanation. Something, or someone, was altering the battlefield. On March 27th, Richter personally examined the wreckage of the latest loss. SDKFZ-222, number 237, had flipped on the road to Cervaro. Commander dead, gunner wounded. The driver swore the vehicle had come to a sudden stop at speed. Richter crawled under the twisted metal. The front axle was bent but intact. No blast damage, no explosive residue, yet there were subtle marks on the wheel housing, scrapes, that suggested something thin, something strong, had snagged the axle at high velocity. Nothing about this wreck made sense. Someone had found a way to bend the rules of war itself. Under the wreckage, Richter spotted a fragment of wire embedded in the wheel well, rusted barbed wire. Whether German or American standard issue was impossible to tell, but its placement was deliberate, strung across the road at exactly the right height to catch a scout car's front axle. On March 29th, Richter submitted his findings to Division Intelligence. The report was skeptical. Barbed wire, they argued, couldn't stop a light armored car. Its weight and momentum were too great. Yet Richter persisted, insisting the marks told a story that defied conventional wisdom and hinted at a cunning, unseen hand on the battlefield. 3 scout cars destroyed, all in the same inexplicable pattern until someone considered the possibility of wire. German intelligence questioned captured American soldiers. None had knowledge of tripwires. Field interrogations of the fallen yielded no documentation, no reference in manuals, no training on such tactics. Yet the incidents kept occurring. By early April, German reconnaissance units around Casino were operating under new orders. Every road had to be scanned for hidden wire obstacles before advancing. A simple, improvised tactic had forced a sophisticated army to rethink its approach, and none of the Americans involved had ever been authorized to act. Scout cars now crept along at half speed. Commanders dismounted to inspect every suspicious stretch of terrain. This cautious approach cut their reconnaissance effectiveness by 40%. The Americans didn't understand why the Germans had suddenly become so careful, but they noticed the patrols were less frequent, less aggressive. Artillery strikes called in by reconnaissance dropped by half. Casualties from scout car attacks effectively stopped. And yet, officially, no one knew about the tripwires. Captain Morrison pieced it together on April 3, 1944, realizing the quiet revolution that had begun with Dalton's midnight gamble. Captain Morrison was inspecting the company's defensive positions when he stumbled upon Private Williams rigging a wire across a logging road. The setup was identical to Dalton's: 2 shovels, barbed wire at axle height. Williams froze under the captain's gaze. Morrison studied the wire, then tested the tension himself. "Where did you learn this?" Williams said nothing. "That's an order, Private." "Corporal Dalton, sir," came the quiet reply. Morrison was silent for a long, measured moment, absorbing the revelation. The method was spreading, unauthorized, lethal, and brilliantly effective. In the distance, artillery rumbled, a constant reminder that the war had not paused. Soldiers were still dying. Yet here was a method that worked, a simple, improvised tactic requiring no special equipment,
something any soldier could build, and it was saving lives. "Show me 2 more setups before dark," Morrison ordered, scanning the terrain. "I want to see placement options for different conditions." Williams blinked, startled. "Sir, that's an order, Private." By April 10th, Morrison had documented 17 wire installations across the company's sector. He interviewed every soldier who had set one, recorded the results meticulously, and calculated the success rate. 87% of enemy scout cars that struck the wires were disabled, flipped, or rendered immobile. 0 friendly casualties, 0 cost beyond issued shovels and barbed wire.
0 friendly casualties. Total material cost, 30 feet of barbed wire and 2 standard-issue shovels. Equipment so ordinary, it passed through the supply chain unnoticed. Morrison compiled everything into a 3-page report. Technical specifications, recommended placement zones, measured tension values, success percentages, even projected tactical impact. He sent it to battalion on April 12th. The reply arrived a week later, on April 19th. Method unauthorized. Discontinue immediately. Violates field manual obstacle employment regulations and fails engineering safety standards. Morrison read the message twice, the words cold and bureaucratic against the reality he'd seen in the field. Then, he closed the folder and let it slide into the stack of ignored paperwork. He wasn't going to pull the wires down. Nobody was. And as the days passed, the results spoke louder than any regulation. The tripwires stayed in place. The casualty numbers kept falling. And officially, nothing was happening. But the battlefield told a different story. In February 1944, before the wires, the 34th Infantry Division lost 47 men to reconnaissance vehicle attacks. In March, after the method quietly spread through the ranks, that number dropped to 12. By April, it fell to 3. Reconnaissance vehicle sightings plummeted as well, 147 in February, 89 in March, just 34 in April. Artillery strikes called in by German recon followed the same downward curve. Something unseen was cutting their eyes out, one patrol at a time. By late April, the numbers were impossible to ignore. February's artillery calls stood at 203. March dropped to 127. April fell again to 58. Someone at division finally connected the dots. Colonel Anderson, Division Intelligence, pulled the casualty logs, the recon reports, the field notes, and saw the pattern nobody was admitting out loud. He sent a small investigation team to the front. They found the tripwires within 48 hours. Anderson's reaction was cold logic. He couldn't authorize a tactic that violated every line of the field manual, but he also couldn't shut down the only thing that was actually reducing losses. So he chose the middle path, the officer's version of silence. No orders to continue, no orders to stop. Just a memo filed into oblivion and a deliberate blind eye turned toward the men who were quietly rewriting battlefield doctrine. In May 1944, the 34th Infantry Division was finally pulled from the front lines for rest and refit. Dalton's company moved to a rear area near Naples, real beds, hot meals, and for the first time in months, no scout cars prowling the roads. On May 23rd, Dalton was summoned to division headquarters. He reported in his cleanest uniform, though it still bore the grime and wear of months at the front. Inside a tent office, Colonel Anderson awaited him. "Colonel Dalton," he said, voice measured, "I've read the reports about your wire method." Dalton straightened, unsure what to expect. "Sir?" he began, tense. "I'm not here to punish you," Anderson interrupted. "I'm here to ask you to train others." Dalton blinked. He hadn't expected that. Anderson laid it out plainly. The 36th Infantry Division was rotating in to take over the 34th Sector, and they needed a way to counter German reconnaissance immediately. The anti-tank school took 3 weeks and required equipment nobody had, not out here, not in this war. Dalton's method took a single night, and whatever rusted barbed wire happened to be lying in a supply dump. "I can't make it official," Anderson said, folding his hands on the desk, "but I can assign you to a training detail." He leaned forward. "You teach the technique to scout units, sniper teams, anyone operating forward of the line. In the paperwork, we'll call it improvised obstacle placement."
A small, tired smile crossed the colonel's face. Nobody needs to know exactly what that means. Dalton spent the first 2 weeks of June 1944 doing something no one in the Army had ever trained him to do: teach a battlefield secret. 60 soldiers rotated through his improvised course. Scouts, snipers, engineers, every man who operated close enough to the front to see the skin of a 222 through the morning haze. They arrived skeptical. Barbed wire didn't stop armor, that was gospel. But Dalton showed them the photographs. He gave them the numbers. Flipped scout cars, captured crews, casualty charts that dropped like a cliff the moment the wires appeared. Skepticism turned to focus, and focus turned to precision. Placement, angle, tension, concealment, recovery, every inch mattered, and Dalton drilled it until they could do it blind in the dark. By July 1944, the method had quietly slipped into 3 divisions. By August, it was moving across the Italian front like an unspoken current. No paperwork, no doctrine, just a whispered technique surviving the chain of command by flowing around it, soldier to soldier, night to night, road to road. Conservative estimates later credited Dalton's tripwire method with disabling or destroying 43 German reconnaissance vehicles between March and August 1944. Each of those vehicles represented artillery strikes that never came, fire missions that would have chewed through foxholes, aid stations, and entire platoons. The true number of lives saved was impossible to pin down with precision, but analysts placed it somewhere between 300 and 400 men, an entire battalion spared by a coil of wire and 2 rusted shovels. Official reports, of course, told a different story. The drop in reconnaissance casualties was attributed to improved defensive awareness and enhanced anti-tank readiness, neat phrases that fit comfortably inside doctrine. The paperwork never mentioned Dalton, it never mentioned the wires, but every soldier who survived because a scout car never reached its firing point knew the truth. Dalton's name never appeared in any official report. His innovation, the tripwire method that had quietly rewritten survival on the front, earned him no commendations. The Army preferred it that way. Admitting that a single corporal had solved a problem that had stumped engineers and officers alike was, apparently, bad for morale.
James Dalton survived the war. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of sergeant and the combat infantryman badge pinned to his chest. No medals for the tripwires, no official recognition, only the respect of the men who knew what he had done, which was all he ever wanted. He returned to Gary, Indiana. In January 1946, U.S. Steel rehired him as a switchman, back among the rail yards, couplers, and cables he had known before the war. He married Dorothy, a woman from East Chicago, and settled into a life as ordinary and steadfast as the work that had shaped him. Dalton and Dorothy had 3 children. He never spoke much about Italy. When asked, he would simply shrug. "I did my job, and I came home," he'd say. Once a year, on March 12th, the anniversary of that cold morning in 1944, he received phone calls from Morrison, Williams, and Jackson. They spoke for a few minutes, recalling Chen, Brennan, and Vargas, the fog, the scout cars, the wire. In 1963, a military historian researching German reconnaissance losses in Italy noticed an unusual spike in vehicle rollovers during early 1944, concentrated in the casino sector. Following leads and veteran interviews, he was eventually directed to Dalton through Morrison. The quiet corporal who had rewritten the rules of survival finally surfaced in history, not through medals or reports, but through the memory of those who had survived because of him. Dalton agreed to a single interview. He explained the method in detail, providing dates, measurements, and tactical insights, but with one condition: his name must not appear. The historian honored his request. When the article appeared in 1965 in the Journal of Military History, the innovation was credited vaguely to unidentified NCOs of the 34th Infantry Division. James Dalton passed away in 1987 at the age of 63, a heart attack in his living room. His obituary in the Gary Post-Tribune noted only his service in World War II and 41 years at U.S. Steel. No mention of tripwires, flipped scout cars, or the hundreds of lives quietly saved by the man who had rewritten battlefield survival with little more than rusted shovels and barbed wire. Dorothy always knew he had done something significant in Italy, but she never knew the full story. The method outlived the man. Post-war analysis by Army engineers confirmed its effectiveness. By 1949, wire obstacles set at axle height were officially incorporated into doctrine as a sanctioned method for disabling light reconnaissance vehicles. The training manuals credited field observations from the Italian campaign, quietly preserving the innovation Dalton had pioneered. Today, modern militaries continue to teach variations of the technique. Wire-based vehicle traps remain a key principle in IED countermeasures. The lesson endures. Sometimes the simplest solution, executed with precision and courage, is the one that saves the most lives. And sometimes the men in the mud know more than the officers in headquarters. Innovation in war doesn't come from committees reviewing proposals or engineers running calculations. It comes from those who have seen their friends die and can't stand it anymore. From corporals who refuse to accept helplessness. From switchmen turned soldiers who learn to solve life and death problems with little more than wire and rusted shovels because nobody was going to hand them anything better. It is in those moments, in the quiet ingenuity of the frontline soldier, that the rules of survival are rewritten and lives are quietly saved. Through men who risked punishment to save lives and never sought recognition, a simple wire became a tool that saved hundreds. The method is still taught, still used, but the man who invented it returned to the rail yards, keeping his story to himself. Sometimes that is exactly how it should be. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with untold histories from the battlefield and beyond. Share a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for helping preserve these stories and for honoring the courage that often history forgets.